I'm talking with Steph Gaudreau. Helps athletic women over 40 fuel themselves better, get stronger, increase their energy, and perform better in the gym. She's a sports nutritionist and lifting coach. In her best-selling book, The Core 4, she details a 4-pillar approach to getting stronger, embracing your body, and owning your power. Steph has a degree in biology, human physiology. She is a certified sports nutritionist from the International Society of Sports Nutrition, certified personal trainer from the Academy of Sports Medicine, and menopause coaching specialist. Her podcast, Fuel Your Strength, started in 2015 and has over 4 million downloads. She is an international speaker and has been featured in Outside, Self, and ESPN Radio. Steph, I have been following your work for a very long time on Instagram and other social media channels, and it's just truly an honor to have you on the show today. And I know with my work with my clients, group members, and just interactions that I've had with other active women in midlife online, like what you're bringing to the industry of sports and women over 40 is it's unique, and just really appreciate everything that you're bringing, because it's giving us a different perspective on how we can look at our bodies, body image, strength, promoting our health through exercise without falling into the dumpster fire of diet culture. So
Yeah.
I appreciate you.
Thank you.
We're going to have a great conversation today for sure.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So let's just start with, I like to always ask a little bit of a history question to folks. It kind of goes with my former history degree, but tell us about your relationship with exercise and your body, say, since it's evolved since high school. Like how did you get into what you're doing today?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's been an up and down all around journey, learning a lot of different things and figuring out how to be an athletic person, a woman who is not, like you said, falling into all of the diet culture traps that are out there, and really looking to fuel for, feeling great and performing well and doing all those things. So for me, going back to high school, I was always an athletic kid, and that continued through high school and beyond. But I got teased a lot by a family member for my weight. And so pretty early on, just felt like there was something wrong with my body. And I think that's such a shared experience. But for me, no one ever talked about what should you eat if you're an athletic teenager or a kid or a young adult. And it wasn't, I think, until 1992 or 94, where a lot of us were maybe just starting high school, if we're in our 40s or, we're in high school, that even the term female athlete triad was introduced. It wasn't a coined term until we were in high school. So you kind of have this historical, like you said, record of going back and thinking, we weren't having these conversations with teen girls about how you need to eat if you're athletic, and you need to have enough energy, and you need to support your body and see how it's growing and support your bone health and all these things. This was not part of the conversation. So that really kind of, I think a lot of us learned about nutrition from diet magazines or from magazines like Cosmopolitan, where that was what we knew. And so for me, being athletic in high school, but was always, for me, something to like control my body, control the size of my body. When I stopped participating in sports my senior year of high school, my body changed a lot. And then I joined a gym and all of these things. So that for me was really my young adulthood, was a lot of confusion about my body. And even though I was athletic, not understanding how to work with my energy needs or just the building blocks of what we need as people. And it wasn't until much, much later that I got interested in sports nutrition specifically, because I was still participating in athletics and had no idea what my body required to function at a level of health and well-being, never mind performance.
Yeah, I resonate so much with your story too, because I'm remembering, you and I are about the same age, we're in our 40s. And even from the place of, the disconnect between sport and eating disorders. As
Mhm.
I remember the health class after school specials about girls that had anorexia or bulimia, whatever. And so there's definitely some stigma around that, and like, oh, that's bad. I don't want to end up like that. But but everything that we saw in those films, or the way disordered eating was talked about then, it was separate from sport. And we looked at sport more as you're promoting your health
Mhm.
and you're able to be a strong woman. And so I think, at least for me and my experience, that disconnect then had me thinking, oh, I'm doing all of this healthy eating and all of this running, because I was a competitive marathon runner and cross country runner in high school. And I kept seeing that as, I'm doing this to be healthy. I'm supposed to be doing this stuff. I'm not like totally restricting or not eating enough food, or like having the apple and the Diet Coke or whatever for lunch, like you saw in those films. Like, I'm not doing that. But you're right, that female athlete triad was not talked about. There wasn't as much conversation in sport for younger girls and women then around like how slippery that slope can be around sport performance, body size related to whatever sport you're doing, and nutrition. It was a huge missing gap.
Yeah, absolutely. And also the unintentional side of things too, right? So how we can really unintentionally slide into that low energy availability, that chronic condition where we are not providing our bodies with enough energy to, once we subtract out the energy that we're using for our training, right? For whatever sport or training that we're doing, we don't have enough energy left over. And sometimes that will occur because if we're talking about, especially younger people, like they may not have control over the food purchasing and preparation in their family. They may have just joined a sport and maybe it's sort of preseason. So we're doing 2-a-days and the training volume has gone way up, but they're not changing their eating habits to compensate. And certainly we see this in adults as well. But a lot of times we have that dichotomy where sometimes we're seeing people slide into that low energy availability state very purposefully, right? Because of trying to restrict, because of the pressures of a certain sport or the pressures to look a certain way, maintain a certain amount of leanness or smallness for that sport and its supposed performance benefit, which is questionable at best. But then we also have that other side of things where sometimes you just don't know better. And they sometimes also can kind of coexist. So it gets very messy sometimes because people will say, well, I'm not intentionally trying to diet, or I'm not intentionally trying to get smaller, but I notice that I'm not eating enough. And, are those two things even related? And it's amazing how much of a disconnect there can be because people feel like, well, I'm not intentionally trying to do those things, so I must be fine. But there's a lot of really basic education that I feel like people need. And this is where I was in 2012 when I hired a sports nutritionist, because I was then doing CrossFit competitively. I had just come off of 8 years of racing mountain bikes. So I was in the endurance community, and then was doing triathlons at the end of that. So I was doing off-road Xterra triathlons and went right into competitive CrossFit. And again, had really no idea what I was doing and really started to feel the effects of that chronic low energy availability, and was just thinking, what's wrong with me? Why can't I perform better? And so in a lot of cases, what people do is they double down. And we see this with women in their 40s, especially, is like, or beyond, is I'm not seeing the results that I thought I would from my training or the things that I'm doing. So I must then double down on the training and eat way less in order to see the results. And so we get into this really sticky situation. We get into this sort of feed forward cycle where it just intensifies, and it's very counterintuitive, sort of what we need to do, and very scary for a lot of people to actually consider changing things up and moving in a different direction. So that's kind of where I found myself in 2012, feeling like my moods were all over the place. I was having trouble sleeping, constantly sore, lots of injuries piling up, not seeing much progress with my training despite being in there 5 days a week. And finally just said, I have to figure this out. And so I hired a sports nutritionist to help me. And the writing was very, very plain on the paper, or the screen, when I saw, what was my energy intake. what was my carbohydrate intake? What was my protein? Like all those things were very, very low. And so it was no wonder, my body was really struggling to keep up with the demands I was putting on it. So that was sort of the linchpin for me to think about doing something different, and then to get really interested in helping other people do that as well.
Yeah. So what was that process like then for, that age old adage, like we know when we know better, we do better. So, but I know also from being a former athlete, that self-identity that goes with this is what my body looks like, this is how I perform in the sport. And even though we want to perform better, but sometimes that self-identity and that mental health piece can be our barrier to eating more to fuel the performance more. So what was that like for you to go through that, probably that both that mental shift as well as the tactical, physical, day-to-day eating differently?
Yeah, it was not easy. And this is why I'm always advocating for people to get support. Because if I had just hired, if I had just, I don't know, done some kind of like a macro thing, or, just like look at the numbers, I probably would have freaked out and run away. And I remember, and I have all the emails I had back and forth with my coach. So when I go back and check my accuracy, when I retell stories, I'm like, no, actually I was saying these things, that I was very concerned about my, level of leanness. Would that change? My coach at the time was like, I do not care what your body fat percentage is. I just want you to be healthy and strong. And so my coach was also a voice of reason there. And then and that was my CrossFit coach. And then my the nutritionist that I was working with was really patient and persistent, but I was really struggling with that idea of I know I'm not performing to the level that I could be, and I'm feeling the negative effects of that. But at the same time, I was terrified that my body composition would change and things would get way worse, and I would get on this slippery slope to who knows what. So that was really hard when it came down to the implementation of the things I needed to change. And I rattled them off really quickly, right? My overall calorie intake was too low. I mean, I had 2 days out of the 7 where I sort of took a food log that I was eating 1,000 calories a day, which is very little, right?
So little, especially with performance training.
I mean, for anyone, right? But
Yeah.
then to add on the training on top of it. And my carbohydrates were really, really low, and my protein was low. So for me, the easiest thing to attack was probably the protein. And that's where I was making the biggest strides. But when I checked, I went back and looked at the check-in forms from like a month later, 2 months later, 3 months later. He was still pointing out, hey, like carbohydrate intake's kind of low. And I had come from that space where I learned, or I thought that carbohydrates were bad for me, which is exactly the opposite of what you need when you're doing glycolytic training. It didn't match up, but I didn't know that at the time. So for me, I had to really get past and be patient with myself. It was not overnight, but as I started to eat more, of the right things that I needed to fuel myself, then I was like, oh, I am feeling better. Oh, like this horrible, scary thing that I was really terrified would happen, like didn't actually come to fruition. And I went on a few months later to have a really great performance at a competition that I did with the team. And I felt amazing because I was, spoiler alert, eating enough, and I can say that kind of in a joking way looking back, but it was really hard to come to terms with, especially having grown up and really come of age in the late 80s and early 90s when, stick thin supermodels and all this, I feel like the pressures were different. It was just a different time in our culture. And those were sort of the role models for girls. It wasn't like we didn't have necessarily the athletes that we have today or people talking about this stuff. So I feel like for those of us that grew up in that time, there was definitely a lot of pressure to feel like we had to look a certain way or we had to maintain a certain smallness. And it gets really messy then when you start to confront those fears or those apprehensions that come along with the idea of eating more. And it's still, even when I work with my students and my clients today, the concept of eating more is terrifying to some people. It's like, we know that's the thing that we need. And we're not necessarily talking about overfeeding, right? We don't need to go that far in a lot of cases, but just need to provide enough of what's necessary to really be our best and to keep our health and well-being in mind, our physical health and our mental health. And you've touched on mental health a couple of times. And that's one of the things that people don't associate with being in that chronic low energy availability state. The mood changes, the difficulty concentrating, the difficulty with focusing. And sure, that plays out in sport, but it also plays out in the rest of your life. So now we have this age bracket of women who are approaching or in perimenopause, if you're in your 40s. And a lot of the signs of low energy availability are also, some of them also cross over and are similar signs that people experience in the menopause transition as being bothersome. Now, I tell people, like, I'm not here to say that eating more is a panacea. And of course, there are other supports you might need to have as you're going through this transition. But it's amazing how many of these bothersome signs and symptoms are similar between these two conditions. So whether it's underfeeding, underfueling, and or the natural menopause transition that we will go through. So eating more isn't necessarily going to magically resolve all symptoms of perimenopause, for example, and no one's claiming that that's the case. But if we're fueling ourselves better, we're providing ourselves the nutrients that we need, sometimes people start to feel just a little bit better than they did before. And then they notice that their training gets better too, which feeds forward into that sort of positive mental space. Like, when you really identify as an athletic person, that's an important part of your life and how you organize your life and your priorities. It can be difficult when you feel like you can't show up and do the kind of training that you're used to, or just feel like you're performing at some level that's not a struggle every single day. So there's a lot of interesting crossover between those two, I feel like.
Absolutely. One of the things that you just said that I hadn't thought of before, but our age group, this, say, probably 40s on up to 50s, we grew up in a time where first we weren't allowed to eat fat. And then right as we were going through puberty, high school, early adulthood, now we weren't allowed to eat carbs. Mm-hmm. And so our whole life, both from when we were kiddos, I remember, my first diet around puberty time was all about fat-free. And my consciousness around what I'm not supposed to eat was around fat-free. But then you're right, because of the age group we shifted into, now we're doing no carb too, no carb, low carb. And so that's just kind of fueled that. And I think that that's a really great connection for people to understand, in that, we're not saying that food will completely fix perimenopause symptoms, but if you've grown up in these last 30, 40 years of what's gone on historically with food and diet and food manipulation for diet, you are probably also in the space where you're not eating enough, period, and you're not eating enough of those two macronutrients. Protein has never really been on the chopping block. And obviously, as we move into midlife, we have some different mindfulness around protein. But to really help women understand that could also be just another tool in your perimenopause toolbox, that to make sure you are eating enough. And then obviously if there's symptoms, other symptoms that are happening, but at least we've checked off that low-hanging fruit of, okay, I'm eating enough, I'm eating balanced, I've got adequate carbs, I've got adequate healthy fats, and I'm still feeling this way. Okay, great. What else can I add to my support system too? So along those lines, with women's fitness and strength training in midlife, why do we need to pay more attention to building strength as we get older? And how can we do that without following into the dumpster fire of diet culture, particularly if someone maybe they weren't super athletic growing up and in their 20s, but now they've come into this perimenopause space and they're like, oh, I keep hearing that I should be doing some strength training or lifting for my bones, or I should get more cardiovascular workouts in. Like, what could that look like for someone? And why is it important? Why is it important to do that without falling into diet culture too?
Yeah, it's so tricky in on one level. On one level, you'd think that's fine. You just get in there, you're going to lift weights, it's going to be great. You're not going to ever think about your body image, or everything is always going to be positive. But the reality is that we live in a diet culture. We are exposed to this stuff constantly. And sometimes it's almost a bit like, once you see it, now you see it everywhere. Once you know about it and you're starting to learn about diet culture in the ways that the sort of insidious ways that it influences us, you start to see it all over the place. And you're like, I can't unsee it now. And it's everywhere. And I want to just go back to my bubble. But, I think first and foremost, why is this important? We know that without the intervention of things like resistance training, we are going to start to lose muscle mass, probably more slowly at first, right? Starting at around age 30. That rate of muscle loss tends to accelerate once we're in menopause, because we have lost that estrogen signal that appears to also play a role in things like maintaining our muscle mass. We can't just say, well, we don't need to lift weights, we have estrogen, but estrogen may have a role, for example, in helping stimulate things like muscle satellite cells. So there's some interesting connection there, but we also need that mechanical tension of lifting and actually pushing our bones and our muscles against these loads. But if we don't take active steps, we will start to lose that muscle mass. And then we get into that clinical condition called sarcopenia, which is where we have a loss of muscle mass and loss of strength and or loss of power. And for a lot of people, it's all three. Can we 100% attenuate the loss of muscle mass as we're going through the natural process of aging? Likely not, but we can do a heck of a lot to influence it and to slow down that loss. And yes, even gain strength, gain muscle, keep some degree of our speed and power and be able to move quickly, those sorts of things. So there's a lot we can do if we avoid disuse. So I think when we're talking about strength training and resistance training, we have to keep emphasizing that. Yes, muscle loss is a thing if we choose to do nothing about it, but we can do things to influence that. Bone is similar, right? Of course, without the signal of estrogen. And frankly, what happened when you were developing, right? When you were in adolescence, what was that bone mineral lay down like? Can obviously put you at a higher risk for things like osteopenia and osteoporosis. But again, there's a lot we can do dietarily, making sure we're getting an adequate amount of weight bearing and pulling on the bone, specifically with things like strength training. So again, a really positive message that I hope people hear, which is it's not too late. It's not all is lost. Where does diet culture come into this is tricky again, because a lot, I will say, I'm just going to go out on a limb here and say the majority of what I see on social media is all about fitness for weight loss. That's the primary sort of almost conflating fitness with the aesthetic payoff or the aesthetic outcome of weight loss. And you see this very clearly in the multitude of before and after pictures that trainers will post. And I talked about this on a podcast probably last year. I understand why people do this because it's what people have always done. But it also muddies the waters, I think, for people because we conflate fitness with a look. Fitness is our ability to do a task and how well suited we are to doing that task. So how's your fitness in terms of your strength training? How's your fitness in terms of your aerobic capacity? If you want to be a swimmer, how's your swimming fitness? Just because you have good aerobic capacity, you said that you came from a running background. Just because you're suited to running and you have good cardio from running doesn't mean you're going to have the easiest time being a swimmer, right? It's two totally different things. So how well suited to the task are we? And unfortunately, in the world of fitness in general, things get very focused on how someone looks as the first and foremost and most important thing. Or looking at somebody and saying, wow, they must be super fit. Well, what is that? How do you know? What does that mean? So a lot of women will see before and after pictures, and us human beings, we love a transformation story, whether it's a house flip on TV or a makeover show or those before and after pictures it pushes the right emotional buttons in our brain. And so we see that and we think, ooh, I want that too. And I want to be clear here, like there's nothing wrong with wanting to participate in fitness because you want to feel different, you want to get stronger, you have goals. But it's when we boil that only down into the look, and then we will do anything to get the look, or we have to undergo ultra restrictive methods to get that outcome. That's where things get really entrenched with diet culture. And to your point, to bring it back to what you said earlier, this is where the slippery slope kind of comes in for real for people, is they start to get praise. Look at how dedicated you are. Look at how good you look. And we never know behind the scenes what somebody is doing to accomplish that, especially if they're doing it through either really unhealthy nutrition behaviors or unhealthy training behaviors, or heaven forbid, they've gone through something super tragic or very stressful, or they're sick and they can't eat. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why people's body size can change even quite dramatically in a short period of time. And so we either seek that praise, or we just want to give it to people if we see it looks like they're doing something regarding fitness, and it just gets really intertwined, and we never quite know what that person has done to achieve that. So I think those are some of the ways in which, and there are probably far more than I don't have time to go into, but those are some of the ways I feel like in midlife, especially when women are coming out of a period of maybe helping raise the children, or they've really buckled down with their career and spent less time on themselves, or they just had a health issue come up, or a family member go through a health crisis. That midlife time is so common for women, especially, to say, oh my gosh, I have got to do something. And when you couple that urgency with the very alluring before and after pictures and those sorts of things that we see, it's so easy to get sucked into, especially the programs or the people out there who are selling you the quick fixes, who are selling you the really kind of unhealthy methodologies to achieve that look. And it's so tempting. I totally get it. I really, really do. But I'm more interested in what can you maintain for the long term? And are those behaviors that you're doing truly healthy for you? Because if achieving the end outcome in the after photo, you had to do all sorts of stuff to get to that point, and potentially your mental well-being or your physical health is compromised as a result. To me, as a coach and a nutritionist, that is not a win. That is it. If you're worse off than when you started, or you achieve the look, but now you have disordered eating patterns that you didn't have before, or they're stronger than they were before, what was that truly worth it? So I feel like those are some of the reasons why the diet culture element is so easy to get enmeshed with. And oftentimes it's not even a super conscious decision. It's just like, I want that thing, or my friend is doing this boot camp with a crazy diet attached to it, and it just seems like the right thing to do because look, they got great results. Maybe your friend was eating 800 calories a day. I mean, we just don't know. So it's tricky.
I think, midlife is such a ripe time, which is why I love working in this population, because I can identify with the population too, in that we are so susceptible to those validation messages, or that we want to get those messages. And it's bumping up against our reality check of, oh, I don't feel as strong in my body. I don't feel like I did when I was in my 20s or my 30s. And I'm now becoming generally concerned about my health. But yet we still have that health and body size very much tied together and tied with that validation. But to your point, which is definitely worth highlighting, someone could exercise in a way to try to achieve that validation, but it could be backfiring on their actual health too, especially during this time of life. If you're not eating enough calories, you're not eating enough protein and carbs, what's that really going to be doing to the muscle that you're trying to build? Are you just going to kind of be spinning your wheels in the gym or whatever type of activity that you're doing to try to get stronger because you have that motivation too? So I think it's important for women to hear that those two, I don't know if we want to say values, but those two desires can bump up against each other and they could backfire on each other. So in a way, it's important for women to really get clear on their why. And that's such a cliche term and phrase to say, but it's true. Like, get clear on your motivation of like, what is really important to you now in your 40s and 50s? What is going to be important to you in your 70s and 80s? And how can we help you with exercise and nutrition and mindset and lifestyle behaviors, those health promoting behaviors? How can it more benefit you to focus on those things now so that you can have what you want in your 70s and 80s? And is that really going to be a certain body size, or is that going to be able to bend over and tie your shoes or live independently when you're 80?
Absolutely. There's a huge longevity piece to that as well. And I think a lot of people are realizing that it's not just about the length of the years, but the quality of those years as well. So that's really where a lot of things like strength training, balance training, being mobile and flexible. And recently I did a reel about the idea of being more of a Swiss Army knife and being more well-rounded in your training as you get older, because different kinds of exercises or training have different benefits for us. And some people said, this is really overwhelming. And in a way I thought these, when we boil it down and we look at from the WHO, which has trickled down to different countries and how we express things like exercise guidelines, it does include, if you're over 65, it includes the balance piece. But for people who are under 65, is all about strengthening your muscles and cardiovascular fitness. And so right there, we realize that neither one is more necessarily important than the other. They're both important for us to have well-rounded fitness, for us to be able to participate in the things we want for, disease mitigation or disease prevention, those sorts of things. And, of course, the balance component for fall prevention, which I think, in my opinion, should start far before 65, because we do see even adults in their 40s or with disuse, even earlier than that, have difficulty with things like balance. So going from there, and then we just kind of sprinkle on top the other things that are important. But when we look at that fitness, why are those things there? And can those things actually help us to live better quality in our years? We know that muscle mass is so correlated to longevity. We know being able to get up and down off the floor has that piece as well. So are we starting to think about those things, not just how small someone is, It's how well can you function? How well can you do these things? Or can you improve your ability to do these things? I think that we're starting to see an understanding in this shift that maybe 20 years ago we weren't really focused on. And then where do we go from there? How do we disseminate that to the masses? How do we get people involved and excited to exercise and to stay moving? I train with a guy in jiu-jitsu who's 71. He has to get up and down off the mat, just alone, getting up and down off the mat. We do that over and over and over again in one class, and when I asked him, what's the what's the secret? What's the advice that you would give somebody who's much younger than you? And he just said, just don't stop moving. Like you've got to do what you can to stay in motion, to keep going and not stop, because once we stop, we start to see those decrements in all of the things that we talked about. So yeah, advice from a 71-year-old is just keep moving.
I'm fortunate enough to spend time through my work and everything. I'm fortunate enough to spend quite a bit of time with my dad, who just turned 80 this year. And for his 80th birthday, and I'm not saying numbers here for people to compare themselves by any means, but for his 80th birthday, he did an 18-mile hike up and over a pass at a little under 8,000 feet. And he, just like your teacher, he has been active most of his life, not in a super competitive way. He just had an active job, and he's continued to just keep moving.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't go as fast as he used to. He does his little walk 25 steps, pause, take, I think it's 50 breaths, and then walk another 25 steps. But that's what got him through doing a hike like he did this year, and any of his other hikes. But it's just that idea of we just keep moving. We might change and alter how we do things and not get hung up on, well, I used to do it this way or this fast when I was in my 20s, 30s, 40s. That's not the point. In fact, that could keep us stuck in more of a mindset of like, well, I can't do it that way. Forget it. I'll just stop. And instead think of like, just keep going in whatever way that your body is capable of doing at the time. And I'm wondering too, along those lines, how you help women in this midlife space kind of cut through that noise. I loved your Swiss Army knife reel, by the way. And so we'll use a little pun on that, but yeah, how you help women kind of cut through that noise, and both from the nutrition perspective to be fueling their strength, but also from this movement perspective, so that they can try to find more clarity in how they want to live a more expansive life as they go into advanced years.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things is revisiting values. And you kind of mentioned values earlier, or knowing your why. And again, there are probably people who are like, oh, God, you're talking about values again. But it's so important, because sometimes we have core values that don't shift all that much across our lives. But if we haven't really sat down to think about what matters most to us, what you valued the most at 20 may not be the same as when you're 45 or 50. And then also our priorities do shift. And if we haven't revisited that in a while, it can be really illuminating, because sometimes we just go off of what we've always done. So that is very powerful when we consider what are we doing this for? Is it, yes, sometimes training is its own means, it's its own end, right? We enjoy the training. We like going to the gym. We like being in our group class. We like going out and the feeling of getting that endorphin rush after we do a run. Like we really maybe enjoy those things, but what is it for is broadening our definition, or broadening our experience to something that really truly matters for us. And if people haven't done some kind of a values assessment or core values activity before, it can be really illuminating when you sit down and look at that. And then you think, well, how are how are the things that I'm doing in my life helping me move closer to those things? And how I participate in fitness, or like what my physical activity is actually helping me to accomplish here. And then looking also for ways to weave that in. So if you really value community, but you always work out by yourself and you're feeling like it's kind of a drag to work out by myself, I kind of hate this. Well, is there a way that you can work community into it and kind of tick off both of those things at the same time? So I think that's a really important exercise. And then also along similar lines is looking for connection pieces to identity. So when we look at intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, people often talk about, why am I not motivated to work out, or how do I get more motivated to train? But when we're talking about psychological motivation, we see that there's a spectrum in between extrinsic motivators and intrinsic motivators. It's not just the two. So we have this sort of progression, but a lot of people come into fitness for extrinsic reasons, purely outside themselves. And one example that's very common is your doctor told you to start exercising, right? Like you go to the doctor, you get a health check, and they say, hey, you have to start exercising. That's very external. So a lot of people start coming into exercise for external reasons, but oftentimes find that over time, those external reasons begin to prompt, it just begins to be less of a motivator for them. It's less enticing for them. There's less of a connection. It's harder to maintain exercise just because of the external factors. And that could be people pleasing. It could be, another example I often give, because this comes up a lot in our age bracket, is you have a high school reunion to go to and you just want to look, you're like, I just need to look good for everybody else. So it's very extrinsically driven. Now it might bring somebody back to exercise, but can it maintain, can it get you through? Can you keep maintaining? Can you keep showing up for that reason? And oftentimes people find when that doctor's voice is faded away, or it gets into the reality of your routine and you're like, this is getting kind of hard. I have to find something else to connect to, or the class reunion has come and gone. And you're like, why am I still doing this then? That's where, if you can slide a little bit more toward, how does this align with my values? How does this align with the type of person I'm trying to become? That's that identity piece. Those two types of extrinsic motivation are further along the spectrum toward intrinsic, that they can oftentimes be that next step. So extrinsic can get us in the door, but it's really the intrinsic reasons, or the reasons that are a little bit more aligned to identity, to values, that can keep us going. And certainly if you have purely intrinsic, internal reasons for exercising that feel really amazing to you, and you've been able to figure those out over the years, wonderful. But a lot of people quit before they get to that point, because they came in for an extrinsic, external reason. That thing is kind of worn off. And they think, why? Well, the 8-week challenge I did is over. I didn't win the lifetime supply of yoga pants. So what's the point? Right? So there's nothing wrong with competition, by the way. There's nothing wrong with reward. There's nothing necessarily wrong with feeling like there's some other reason that's driving you outside of yourself. But noticing when that starts to become less enticing, when there's just a little bit less drive to work toward that thing. So bringing it back around to values, bringing it back around to the type of person you want to become, that identity piece can be really helpful for people. So those are some of the things that I talk about with my clients in terms of, how are you going to make this a feature of your life for the rest of your life? Not just an 8-week spurt. 8 weeks out of the year is great. It's not nothing, but it's also, how do we build this into a lifelong pursuit, a lifelong habit? Because we know exercise is such a health promoting habit, truly. How do we help you do that in a way that you can, seasons come and go, there's going to be shifts and changes. How do we help you stick with this for the rest of your time here? That's really the goal.
I really appreciate that definition, using that intrinsic and extrinsic, and I haven't heard it phrased that way before, but it's so spot on, in that we we have to find that internal motivation. And I really love that piece of connecting it to our identity too, because like you said, the values or the why conversation can get a little tired, but
Mhm.
when we pair it with that identity piece, I think that I'm thinking of a number of clients and group members that will hit home in a different way, because then that helps them try to connect with, I'm doing this for other reasons than just what my body is going to look like. Because independent of these health behaviors, our bodies are still going to change.
Mhm.
Doing health behaviors like exercise and healthy eating are not going to keep your body from not aging. They're just not. Spoiler alert there, and sorry to burst people's bubbles, but they can help us age more comfortably. And like you had mentioned before, like the longevity and quality of life can be better for sure. But again, having that quality of life and longevity be tied to that intrinsic motivator versus just the external, which is I don't want to have a round fluffy body in my 60s, 70s, whatever that may be. So,
Yeah.
Steph, where can people learn more about your work, get connected to some of your programs? Of course, the podcast, we'll put links to that in the show notes, but where would you like to invite people into your world?
Yeah, I think if people are just wanting to learn a little bit more about the types of things that I talk about, then social media is a great place to kind of dip your toe in. So that's at Steph_Gaudreau. And I would say probably Instagram is my favorite platform. So you can check out what I've got going on there. The podcast, Fuel Your Strength podcast, of course. And then any of my lifting programs, coaching, etc., is on my website, which is stephgaudreau.com.
Great. We'll put links to that in the show notes. And it's been wonderful to meet you and get your take on the non-diet fitness space, especially for midlife. It's such, like I said at the beginning, it's such a refreshing take. And we're all lucky to have all of your resources out there. And it's much, much needed in this space for sure. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.